Billionaire notices a disabled homeless woman celebrating alone. What he does next stuns everyone. She was sitting alone in the freezing cold, holding a tiny birthday cake with one shaking hand, and singing happy birthday to herself in a whisper, so small it almost got swallowed by the wind. Nobody stopped. Nobody looked. Cars rushed past her like she was invisible. Like she wasn't even there. Like a 62-year-old woman in a wheelchair, in the middle of winter, with snowflakes settling on her silver hair and tears frozen halfway down her cheeks, was just part of the scenery. But then one car slowed down. And then it stopped. And what happened next? Nobody in that city was ready for it. Nobody could have guessed it. Not in 1,000 years. Not even her. Because the man who stepped out of that car wasn't just any man. And that woman wasn't just any woman. And before this night was over, a secret buried for more than 40 years was going to rise up from the ground like a fire that never actually went out. And it was going to change both of their lives in a way that neither of them had words for. But to understand what happened on that sidewalk, on that cold December night, you need to go back. You need to understand who this woman really is. What she carried. What she lost. And what she never stopped looking for. Where are you watching this from? Drop it in the comments right now. And if you are new here, hit that subscribe button because this story is going to take you somewhere you have never been before. Her name is Ruth Abigail Mensah. And if you had met her 30 years ago, you would have never believed this was the same woman. 30 years ago, Ruth was the kind of nurse that patients asked for by name. The kind that would sit at the edge of a hospital bed at 2 a.m. and hold a frightened patient's hand without being asked. The kind that remembered birthdays, remembered the names of grandchildren from stories patients told during long nights. The kind that cried in the supply closet after losing a patient and then walked back out and kept going because there were others who still needed her. She gave 35 years to that hospital. 35 years of 12-hour shifts, of missed holidays, of sore feet and tired eyes and a heart that somehow never ran out of room for one more person. The nurses called her Mama Ruth. Even some of the doctors did. Not because she was old, but because there was something about her presence that made you feel like you were going to be okay. Like the room got a little warmer when she walked in. She had built a life. A real one. A house with a garden in the back that her husband, a gentle and quiet man named Emmanuel, tended every single weekend like it was holy ground. 2 daughters and a son. A marriage that had weathered things that would have broken other people. They were not rich, but they were full. There is a difference, and Ruth knew it. Her youngest, a boy named Tobias, was 14 years old and already making his mother laugh every single day. He had his father's eyes and his mother's stubbornness, and he wanted to be an architect. He used to draw buildings on the back of paper bags when they ran out of notebooks. Little towers and bridges and houses with big windows. Ruth used to tape them to the refrigerator. Every single one. It was a Thursday evening in October when everything ended. They had gone out for dinner, just the 3 of them, Ruth, Emmanuel, and Tobias, to a small restaurant they loved, the kind of place where the chairs don't match and the food is too good for the price. Ruth had ordered the jollof rice. Tobias had stolen half of it and pretended he hadn't. Emmanuel had laughed so hard he knocked over his water glass. It was a good night. One of those ordinary nights that you don't know to hold on to until it's already gone. On the way home, it started to rain. They never made it home. A truck ran a red light at full speed and hit their car on the passenger side. Emmanuel died on impact. The doctors said he didn't feel anything. Ruth has spent 6 years trying to decide whether that is supposed to make her feel better. Ruth and Tobias were pulled from the wreckage and rushed to the hospital where Ruth herself had worked for over 3 decades. The cruelty of that detail never left her. Being wheeled through the same hallways she had walked 1,000 times, but this time as a patient, this time broken, this time screaming her son's name at nurses who were telling her to stay still, stay calm. You are going to be okay, not understanding that she could not be okay, not until she knew where her boy was. The spinal injury took her legs. She woke up 3 days later, and the doctor sat beside her bed with the careful, practiced expression she recognized immediately because she had worn it herself so many times before. And she knew before he even opened his mouth. She looked down at her legs under the hospital blanket, and she already knew. She never walked again. But that was not the worst part. Tobias was in a coma. And for 8 months, Ruth lived at that hospital. She sold the house with Emmanuel's garden, the house with Tobias's drawings still on the refrigerator. She sold it to cover the surgery costs and the bills and the machines that were keeping her son breathing. She sold it without hesitation. She would have sold everything. She would have sold the air in her lungs if it would have helped. For 8 months she sat beside that bed in her wheelchair, and she talked to him. She read to him from the Bible. She sang to him. She told him about his father. She made him promises. She told him about the buildings he was going to design one day, the bridges, the towers, the houses with big windows. She told him she needed him to come back. And then one morning a young nurse came to find Ruth in the corridor, and the look on that nurse's face made Ruth's entire body go cold. She had seen that look before, too. The nurse told her quietly, carefully, that Tobias had opened his eyes for a few minutes early that morning, that he had spoken, that he had asked for his mother. And then she told her the rest. "He said to tell you he loves you," the nurse whispered. "He said he doesn't want to die. He said he is only 14. Ruth did not scream. She did not collapse. She sat in her wheelchair in the middle of that hospital corridor, and she went completely silent in a way that the staff said was more frightening than any sound she could have made. Like something inside her just stopped. She buried her husband and her son within the same year. Her eldest daughter, Miriam, came to the funeral and stayed for 2 weeks. And then one morning Ruth woke up and Miriam was gone. There was a short note on the kitchen counter of the small rented room they were sharing. It said she was sorry, that she could not carry any more grief, that she hoped her mother understood. Ruth read the note twice, folded it, put it in her Bible, and never mentioned it again to anyone. She was 62 years old, disabled, homeless within months when the money ran dry, and completely alone. Almost completely, because there was one more thing Ruth carried. One secret she had buried so deep inside herself for so many decades that some days she almost convinced herself it wasn't real. A secret from when she was 21 years old, young and frightened and alone in a different way, sitting in a hospital not as a nurse but as a patient, holding a newborn baby boy she had carried for 9 months and loved before she ever saw his face. His father's name was Frederick. They called him Fred. She was in medical school. He was charming and certain and wrong for her in every way she could not see at 21. When she got pregnant, Fred's mother arrived at her door like a verdict. Cold. Efficient. A checkbook already open. She collected the baby. She paid Ruth off. She made it very clear what would happen if Ruth ever tried to come close. Ruth took the money. Not because she wanted to, but because she was 21 with nothing, and the one thing she refused to do was let her son starve while she figured out how to fight a family with lawyers and walls she had no way to climb. She took the money, went to nursing school, and she made a promise to herself and to that little boy she never got to name, that one day she was going to find him, that she was never going to stop looking. For 40 years she looked. Internet searches, phone calls to people near the old neighborhood, letters that came back unopened, dead ends and near misses, and one terrible evening when she found a man she thought might be him, and it wasn't. And tonight, on her 62nd birthday, sitting alone in the snow with a small grocery store cake balanced on her lap and one candle fighting the wind, she had just closed her eyes to make a wish. She wished, like she always did, for the same thing. She wished to find her son before she died. She blew out the candle, and when she opened her eyes, there was a man standing in front of her. He was tall, well-dressed, maybe in his early 40s, and he was staring at her with an expression she had never seen on a stranger's face before. Not pity, not discomfort, not the awkward half-smile people gave when they wanted to help but didn't want to stop moving. He was staring at her like he recognized her, like he had been looking for her too. She opened her mouth to speak, and before she could say a single word, the man said something that made the cake nearly slip from her hands. He said her name. Not ma'am. Not excuse me. He said, Ruth Abigail Mensah? And the world went very, very quiet. Ruth did not move. She did not speak. She did not breathe. The little candle she had just blown out was still sending a thin curl of smoke into the cold night air, and the cake was still warm in her hands, and the snow was still falling the way it had been falling all evening. Quiet, indifferent, steady. But everything else in the entire world had come to a complete stop. Because this man, This stranger in his expensive coat with snowflakes on his shoulders and car keys still in his hand. This man who had no business being in this park on this night, who had no business stopping, who had no business looking at her the way he was looking at her right now. He had just said her name. Her full name. All three of them. In the right order. With the right pronunciation of Mensah, the way only people who knew her family ever said it. Ruth's hands tightened around the cake box. Her knuckles went pale. Years of nursing had trained her to stay calm in moments that would make other people fall apart, and she was calling on every single one of those years right now, dragging them up from somewhere deep in her chest just to keep her face still, just to keep from shaking. "Who are you?" she asked. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. Smaller. Like it belonged to a much younger woman. Like it belonged to a 21-year-old sitting in a hospital room, holding a baby she was about to lose. The man didn't answer immediately. That was the strange thing. Most people, when they approach someone, when they have something to say, they say it. They fill the silence because silence makes them uncomfortable. But this man stood there in the snow, and he let the question sit between them, and he looked at her with those dark, careful eyes, and for just a moment, just one terrible, beautiful moment, his composure cracked. His jaw tightened. His throat moved. And Ruth, who had spent 35 years reading the faces of people who were trying not to cry, knew exactly what she was seeing. "My name is Solomon," he said. "Solomon Adeyemi." Ruth's breath left her body. Not because of the name. The name meant nothing to her on its own. But because of the way he said it. Because of the way he was standing. Because of the shape of his face in the lamplight. A shape she had spent 40 years trying to forget and never fully managed to. The particular angle of the jaw. The way his left eyebrow sat slightly higher than the right when he was uncertain about something. A feature so small most people would never notice it. She had noticed it. On a baby she had held for 4 hours before they took him away. 4 hours. She had memorized every single detail of that baby's face in 4 hours the way only a mother, who knows she is running out of time, can do. The way people memorize things they are terrified of losing. "Solomon," she repeated. The name felt strange and sacred in her mouth at the same time. "I've been looking for you," he said. "For 3 years. My team has been looking. Private investigators, records, searches, everything." He paused. Swallowed hard. "We found you 2 days ago. I've been trying to figure out how to." He stopped. Started again. "I didn't know how to come to you. I didn't know what to say. And then my assistant told me today was your birthday, and I thought maybe." He looked down briefly, and when he looked back up, the crack in his composure had gotten wider. "I didn't want you to spend your birthday alone." Ruth stared at him. 62 years she had been alive. She had delivered hard news and received hard news. She had stood in rooms where families fell apart and rooms where families were put back together. She had outlasted grief that should have killed her. She had learned, through a lifetime of loss, how to keep her face steady when her heart was in pieces on the floor. But right now, holding a grocery store birthday cake in a snowstorm, looking up at a man in his 40s who had her baby's eyebrow and her baby's jawline and the exact same way of going quiet when he was feeling too much. Ruth Abigail Mensah, who had not cried in public in 6 years, began to cry. Not delicately. Not the polished, dignified kind of crying that looks acceptable. The raw kind. The kind that comes from somewhere so deep inside a person it almost sounds like it hurts. Her whole body shook with it. The cake wobbled dangerously in her hands, and Solomon, without thinking, the way you do something when it is instinct rather than decision, stepped forward and caught it before it fell. And then he was kneeling in the snow in front of her wheelchair, holding a birthday cake in both hands, looking up at his mother for the first time in his life. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The snow kept falling. A car moved slowly past on the street behind them. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked twice and went quiet. The whole city was doing what cities do, moving and rushing and not paying attention, completely unaware that 41 years of searching had just ended on a park bench between a homeless woman and a billionaire kneeling in the snow. "I don't know what to call you," Solomon said, his voice low and rough. "I've been thinking about that for 3 years. I didn't know if you'd want me to call you." "Ruth," she said immediately. Then she stopped. Then she said more softly, "Or whatever feels right to you. Whatever you can manage." He nodded slowly. His hands were still holding the cake. "I have so many questions," he said. "So do I," she said. "I don't know where to start." "Neither do I." They looked at each other in the snow. This woman who had spent 40 years looking and this man who had spent 3 years searching. and the distance between all those lost years sat between them like something they could almost touch. Then Solomon did something that nobody who knew him in his professional life would have believed if they'd been told about it afterward. Solomon Adeyemi, who ran a company worth more money than most people could count, who sat in boardrooms and made decisions that affected thousands of people without ever letting them see him flinch. He sat down. Right there on the cold, wet ground beside her wheelchair, in his expensive coat in the snow, and he set the birthday cake carefully between them on the bench, and he said, "Then let's start somewhere small. Tell me something. Anything. Tell me something about yourself that nobody else knows." Ruth looked at him for a long moment, and then impossibly she laughed. It was a short laugh, surprised out of her, the kind you can't plan, and it transformed her face completely. For just a second, she didn't look like a woman who had lost everything. She looked like something older and stronger than grief. She looked like someone who had survived. "I used to tape my youngest son's drawings to the refrigerator," she said. "Every single one. He wanted to be an architect. He drew on paper bags when we ran out of notebooks." Her voice softened at the edges. "He was 14. Solomon was quiet for a moment. "What happened to him?" The laughter faded. Ruth looked at the unlit candle on the cake. "He didn't make it," she said simply. "Car accident 6 years ago. We lost his father the same night. Tobias held on for 8 months." She was quiet for a moment. "He was a brave boy. He was so brave." Solomon said nothing, but his jaw tightened the same way it had when he'd first said her name, and Ruth noticed, and something in her chest recognized it. "And your daughter?" he asked carefully. He had done his research. She could tell. "Gone," Ruth said. Not bitterly. Just factually, the way you stayed a weather condition. She couldn't carry it. "I don't blame her." She looked out at the falling snow. Grief does different things to different people. Some people it breaks open. Some people it closes like a fist. Miriam closed. "I understand it. She paused. "I just wish she'd said goodbye properly." Solomon reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a handkerchief, a real one, cloth monogrammed, and held it out to her without comment. Ruth looked at it for a second, then took it and pressed it carefully to her face. "You did your research," she said. "I did," he said. 3 years' worth. "Then you know where I've been for the last 4 months." "Yes. And you came anyway." "I came because of that," he said. "Not in spite of it." Ruth folded the handkerchief carefully and held it in her lap. "Your grandmother," she said, and her voice changed shape around the word, got harder and more careful. "Frederick's mother. She told me you were given to a good family. She said you would be taken care of." "I was," Solomon said. The words were neutral. His face was not. "She paid me," Ruth said. She had never said this out loud to another living person. Not once in 41 years. It sat in her mouth like something that had been locked away so long it had almost fossilized. "I want you to know that. I want you to know I am not going to pretend it didn't happen or make it sound better than it was. She paid me and I took the money and I left." The silence that followed was the most dangerous moment of the entire night. Solomon looked at her. His expression was unreadable. The snow was still falling. Ruth held herself very still, the way she had trained herself to hold still when she was waiting for news she was afraid of. She had learned that posture in 100 hospital corridors. She was using it now. "I know why you took it," Solomon said finally. "You don't have to forgive me for it," Ruth said. "I'm not asking you to. I know you're not." He looked down at the cake between them. "My grandmother was not a gentle woman. I know who she was. I know what she was capable of." He paused. "She told me you abandoned me." Those were the words she used. Abandoned. He said the word like it tasted wrong. "It took me 3 years of searching and a very good private investigator to understand that what actually happened was a great deal more complicated than that." Ruth was shaking. She couldn't stop it this time. Not from cold. "I looked for you," she said, and her voice broke on the last word, cracked right down the middle. "I looked for so long. The internet, phone calls, letters. I never stopped. I want you to know that. Whatever else you know or don't know, whatever your grandmother told you, I need you to know I never stopped." Solomon looked at her for a long time. And then he said something that cracked Ruth Abigail Mensah open from the inside out. "I know, Mom," he said. "That's actually how we found you. One of the people you called, a woman who used to live near my grandmother's house. She still had your number. She reached out to my team when she saw a news piece about me last year. He paused. She said a woman had been calling every few months for almost 20 years asking about a baby boy named after a king. Ruth pressed Solomon's handkerchief against her mouth with both hands. She had called that woman 17 times over the years. 17. She had kept the number in a small notebook she carried everywhere, a notebook that had survived the accident, had survived the hospital months, had survived the loss of the house, and every other material thing she had ever owned. That notebook was in the bag hanging from the back of her wheelchair right now. She had never thrown it away, because throwing it away would have felt like giving up, and Ruth Abigail Mensah had decided a long time ago that she was not built for giving up. "Come home with me tonight," Solomon said. He wasn't pleading. He wasn't performing generosity for anyone watching. He said it the way you say something when it is simply the only right thing. The way you say something when you have been waiting to say it for 3 years and the moment has finally arrived. Not as charity. Not as anything complicated. Just come home. You and I have 41 years of conversation to have, and I don't want to start it in the snow. Ruth lowered the handkerchief from her face. She looked at this man, her son, her 41-year-old son who had found her after she had searched for decades, who had knelt in the snow in an expensive coat to catch her birthday cake, who had called her mom like it was a word he had been practicing alone for years. And she thought about Tobias and his paper bag drawings and Emmanuel's garden and the nursing shifts and the night on the road and the 8 months and the note Miriam left on the counter and the notebook she never threw away. She thought about 41 years of a promise she had made to a baby they hadn't let her name. She lifted her chin, squared her shoulders, and in that moment she looked exactly like what she was, not a homeless woman in a park, not a victim of anything, not someone to be pitied. She looked like a woman who had walked through fire so many times she had stopped flinching at the heat. "I have conditions," Ruth said. Solomon blinked. Then a slow smile crossed his face. His left eyebrow lifted slightly higher than the right. "Of course you do. I'm not a charity case. I am your mother. There is a difference, and I need you to understand it from the beginning." "Understood. And I want to know everything. About your life. The real things, not the polished version. The hard parts." "Fair enough," he said. "And one more thing." She looked at him steadily. "Frederick, your father, is he still alive?" Something shifted in Solomon's face. Something complicated and shadowed moved behind his eyes. He was quiet for just a beat too long. And then he said, "That depends on which version of alive you mean." Ruth stared at him. "What does that mean?" she asked slowly. Solomon opened his mouth to answer. And then his phone rang. He looked at the screen. His face changed completely. All the warmth drained out of it in an instant, and what replaced it was something Ruth had never seen on his face before. Something that looked like fear. Real fear. The kind that lives in the body, not just the mind. He stood up from the ground. He looked at Ruth. Then back at the phone. "I have to take this," he said. His voice was different now. Tight. "I'm sorry. I have to." "Solomon." Ruth's nurse instincts fired before anything else could. "What's wrong?" He answered the call, held the phone to his ear, listened for 5 seconds, and the color left his face like water leaving a drain. He lowered the phone slowly, looked at Ruth in her wheelchair in the snow, holding his handkerchief, the birthday cake sitting on the bench between them with its unlit candle pointing at the sky. "There's been a development," he said carefully. "With my company." He stopped, seemed to be choosing his next words with great precision, the way you carry something fragile across a room. "Ruth, there is something I haven't told you yet. Something about why I started looking for you 3 years ago." He paused. "It wasn't only because I wanted to find my mother." The snow fell between them. "Then why?" Ruth asked. Solomon looked at her with those dark, careful eyes, and for the first time that night he looked not like a billionaire, and not like a son, and not like a man in control of anything at all. He looked like a man who was afraid of what he was about to say. "Because I'm sick, Ruth," he said quietly. "And I needed to find you before I ran out of time. Subscribe to this channel to support our growth." The snow didn't care. That was the thing about snow. It just kept falling. Soft and quiet and completely indifferent to the fact that a woman in a wheelchair had just had her entire world tilted sideways for the second time in one night. It kept falling on the birthday cake. It kept falling on Solomon's shoulders. It kept falling on Ruth's silver hair and her worn gray coat and her hands, which were now completely still in her lap in the way that hands go still when the brain is too overwhelmed to send them instructions. Sick. She had heard that word 10,000 times in her career. She had delivered it herself more times than she could count, always carefully, always gently, always watching the person's face the way you watch a glass that's been knocked and you're not sure yet if it's going to fall. She knew every version of that word. The versions that meant manageable, and the versions that meant we need to have a harder conversation, and the versions that meant we are running out of time. The way Solomon had said it just now told her exactly which version this was. She didn't scream. She didn't reach for him. She did what Ruth Abigail Mensah had always done when the ground moved under her feet. She went very still. She breathed. She looked at him directly and she said, in her nurse's voice, the one she had spent 35 years building into something steady enough to hold other people's terror inside it, "Sit back down and tell me everything." Solomon looked at the phone still in his hand. Whatever that call had been, whoever had been on the other end of it, the news had not been good. His jaw was tight, and his eyes had gone somewhere far away for just a moment. But when Ruth spoke, he came back. He looked at her, and something in her voice, that same something that had made frightened patients breathe easier for 3 decades, worked on him the same way it had worked on all of them. He sat back down. Not on the ground this time. He sat on the bench beside her wheelchair, close enough that their arms were almost touching. He put his phone face down on his knee. He looked at the birthday cake with its one unlit candle, and he was quiet for a moment, gathering himself the way people do before they say something they've been carrying alone for too long. 3 years ago, he began, I started having headaches. Bad ones. The kind that make light feel like a punishment. I ignored them for months because I was busy and because I was 40 and because men like me are very good at convincing ourselves that our bodies are not allowed to malfunction. He said that last part with a short, humorless sound that wasn't quite a laugh. When I finally went in, they found a tumor. Brain. Left temporal lobe. Ruth closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then she opened them again. Grade, she asked. He looked at her sideways. You're going to speak to me like a nurse, aren't you? I am a nurse, she said simply. Grade 3, he said. When they first found it. It has since decided to become more ambitious. Grade 4. She didn't say it out loud. She didn't need to. The understanding passed between them in the silence the way medical information moves between people who both know what it means. Treatment, she asked. 2 surgeries. Radiation. Chemotherapy that I would not wish on someone I actively disliked. He looked at his hands. The first surgery went well. The second was more complicated. There were months where things were looking. He paused, searching for the right word. Promising was the word my doctors used. Carefully promising. The kind of promising that has a lot of conditions attached to it. And now, he was quiet for a moment. The snow fell between them. That phone call was my lead oncologist, he said. We had a scan last week. He was calling with the results. He stopped. The tumor has grown again, in a location that makes a 3rd surgery extremely high risk. He said it all very carefully, very evenly, the way you say things when you've had a long time to practice saying them. He wants to discuss options tomorrow, which is the medical way of saying the options have gotten fewer. Ruth sat with that. She let it settle. She didn't rush to fill the silence with reassurance the way people do when they're uncomfortable with hard truths, and Solomon noticed, and something in his posture loosened just slightly, the way a person relaxes when they realize they don't have to perform okayness for the person they're talking to. Why did being sick make you look for me? Ruth asked. Solomon turned his head and looked at her fully. Because I realized I was possibly running out of time, and there were questions I had never gotten answers to. About where I came from. About who I was before I became. He gestured vaguely at himself, at the expensive coat and the town car still idling at the curb and the whole assembled weight of everything he had built. This. He said the word like it tasted complicated. I had a good life. My adoptive family was kind. They gave me everything I needed. But there is a difference between a good life and a complete one. And I had this. He touched his chest briefly. This space. This question-shaped space that nobody could fill because nobody could answer it. Who was she? Why did she leave? Did she ever think about me? Ruth's breath caught. Every single day, she said. The words came out rough and immediate, no space between the thought and the saying of it. Every single day of 41 years, Solomon. Not once did I stop. He nodded slowly, like he was filing that away somewhere important, like it was the answer to a question that had been sitting open inside him for his entire life. I believe you, he said quietly. It took me time to get there. When I first found out about you, the real story, not my grandmother's version, I was angry. I want to be honest with you about that. I was angry for about 6 months. You had every right to be, Ruth said. I know. But then I started actually looking at the full picture. What you were dealing with at 21. What my grandmother was capable of. The money trail. The legal documents she made you sign. His voice hardened just slightly at the edges. She was a thorough woman, my grandmother. She covered everything. She made it as difficult as possible for you to ever find me. He paused. She died 4 years ago. I'm not going to perform grief about that. Ruth said nothing. But she heard the years of complicated feeling compressed into that single sentence, and she recognized it because she had her own collection of sentences like that. After the anger, Solomon continued, came something else. Something I didn't have a clean word for. A kind of, he thought about it. Longing, I suppose. Which felt strange at my age. A man in his 40s shouldn't feel like an orphan. But illness has a way of stripping things down to what's true. And what was true was that I was sick, and I was searching, and somewhere out there was the woman who had carried me and lost me, and looked for me for 4 decades. He looked at Ruth. So I looked harder. And I found you. Ruth looked at him for a long time. And Frederick? She asked again. Because she hadn't forgotten. She hadn't missed the way Solomon's face had changed when she asked the first time. The shadow that moved behind his eyes, the words that came out strange and crooked. That depends on which version of alive you mean. She asked it again now because she needed to understand the shape of everything she was walking into. She had learned that in nursing. You need to see the whole wound before you can know what you're dealing with. You can't just look at the surface and make decisions. Solomon was quiet for long enough that Ruth started preparing herself for something bad. Frederick, Solomon said slowly, is alive. He is 71 years old. He lives 20 minutes from my office in a house I suspect he cannot actually afford anymore, but maintains for appearances. He paused. He knows I'm sick. He knows I've been looking for you. And I need you to understand something, Ruth. Frederick is not the man my grandmother shaped and presented to you when you were 21. He is not charming anymore. He is not careful anymore. He is, Solomon looked for the word. Desperate is probably the most accurate. Desperate for what? Ruth asked carefully. For me, Solomon said. Or more specifically, for what I represent. He looked at his hands again. I have no children. My marriage ended 5 years ago, before the diagnosis. She left when the company went through a difficult period, and I learned some things about people that year that I have not fully recovered from. He said that part quietly, without drama, which somehow made it land harder. When I got sick, Frederick reappeared. First with phone calls. Then with visits. Then with his lawyer. He looked up. It turns out that when a billionaire with no heir gets a terminal diagnosis, people who previously showed no interest in being family suddenly develop a very strong interest in being family. Ruth felt something cold that had nothing to do with the snow. He wants your estate, she said flatly. He wants to be recognized as next of kin, Solomon said. He has been very careful about how he phrases it. It's always about family, about making things right, about how he was young and his mother controlled everything, and he deserves a chance to know his son. Solomon's voice was entirely neutral in the way voices go neutral when the feelings underneath them are too large for any particular tone to hold. Some of what he says may even be partially true. I don't know. I genuinely cannot tell anymore where Frederick's regret ends and Frederick's greed begins. They have become very tangled together. Ruth was thinking. She was thinking the way she used to think when a patient's chart had too many conflicting readings, and she needed to cut through all of it and find the thing that was actually true. Does he know you found me? She asked. Solomon hesitated. Just long enough. Solomon. He knows I was looking, Solomon said carefully. He does not know that I found you tonight. He paused. But I made the mistake, some months ago, of telling him why I started looking. That I wanted to find you before. He stopped. Started again. That I was running out of time. Ruth absorbed this. And what did he say when you told him that? He said that finding you would be a mistake. Solomon's voice was very quiet now. He said that you gave me up willingly. That you took money and walked away, and that people who do that don't deserve second chances. He looked at Ruth. I want you to know that I don't believe that. Not anymore. I am telling you because you need to know what you're walking into. Frederick knows things about my medical situation, about my estate, about my legal affairs that he should not know. I have not yet figured out how. The snow was falling harder now. Ruth sat in her wheelchair in the middle of all of it, and she felt something she had not felt in 6 years. Not since the night on the road. Not since the hospital. Not since Miriam's note on the counter. She felt afraid. Not for herself. Ruth had stopped being afraid for herself somewhere around month 5 of sitting next to Tobias's bed watching machines breathe for her child. There was a point grief took you to where your own fear for yourself became very small and very quiet, because you had already survived the unsurvivable, and you knew now that you could keep surviving it, that the human heart was built for more punishment than anyone told you about when you were young. She was afraid for Solomon. This man, her son, her 41-year-old found son, was sick and being circled by something she recognized from years of hospital experience. The particular kind of human hunger that shows up around people who are running out of time. She had seen it in waiting rooms. She had seen it in the faces of distant relatives who appeared at bedsides only when the doctors started using certain words. She knew what it looked like, and she knew how dangerous it was, and she knew that Solomon, for all his intelligence and all his success and all his careful, measured way of speaking, was dealing with it while also managing a brain tumor and a failing marriage and the emotional weight of finding a mother he had spent his whole life not knowing. She reached out and put her hand over his. He looked down at her hand on his. Then up at her face. I want you to listen to me, Ruth said, and the nurse voice was gone now, replaced by something older and more fundamental than any professional training. I am 62 years old. I have buried a husband and a son. I have lost a daughter. I have been homeless for 4 months and disabled for 6 years, and I have had exactly 0 days of self-pity about any of it, because self-pity doesn't keep anyone warm. She held his gaze. I did not spend 41 years looking for you to find you sick and frightened and alone, and then stand to the side while someone tries to take from you what is already yours. Do you hear me? Solomon looked at her. His left eyebrow lifted, just slightly higher than the right. You sound like someone who is about to become a problem for a lot of people, he said. I have been a problem for difficult people my entire life, Ruth said. Ask anyone who ever tried to cut corners on a ward I was working. Ask any doctor who thought comfortable was the same thing as correct. She squeezed his hand once firmly, the way you grip something you are not letting go of. You found me tonight. And I am telling you right now, on my 62nd birthday in the snow, that I am not a woman who can be paid off twice. Something happened in Solomon's face then. Something cracked open. Not dramatically. Not with tears or shaking or any of the visible performances of emotion. Just quietly. Like a window being opened in a room that had been closed for too long. Like something finally getting the air it had been waiting for. And then he did something completely unexpected. He laughed. A real one. Full and sudden and surprised out of him. The kind of laugh that has no performance in it at all. And for just that moment he didn't look sick. He didn't look afraid. He looked like what he was underneath all of it. A man who had been alone with something too heavy for too long and had just, for the first time, set some of it down. Come on, he said, standing and moving to the back of her wheelchair. Let's get you somewhere warm. We have a great deal to figure out. We do, Ruth agreed. As Solomon pushed her wheelchair toward the waiting car, Ruth looked back once at the park bench. At the small birthday cake still sitting there. At the one unlit candle pointing at the sky. She had made a wish before she blew it out. She had wished to find her son before she died. The wish had come true in a way she never could have imagined. But wishes, Ruth had learned over 62 years, rarely came true cleanly. They came true tangled up in things you didn't ask for. Wrapped around complications and dangers and questions you weren't expecting. The car door closed behind them. And in the warm back seat, as the city moved past the windows, Solomon's phone lit up on the seat between them. A text message. No name. Just a number Ruth didn't recognize. She wasn't trying to read it. But the words were large and the screen was bright, and the message was short enough that she saw the whole thing before she could look away. It said, I know you found her tonight. Bring her in, and I will make sure she disappears the way she should have 40 years ago." Ruth stared at the screen. Solomon hadn't seen it yet. He was looking out the other window, rubbing his temple with 2 fingers in the unconscious way people do when a headache is beginning. Ruth looked at the message again. Then she looked at her son. Then very carefully, very deliberately, she reached out and turned the phone face down on the seat. Because some things you deal with tonight. And some things you deal with when the person you love has a moment of peace first. And Ruth Abigail Mensah, who had spent 35 years deciding which information a patient needed right now and which information could wait 60 minutes without causing harm. She knew the difference. But as the car moved through the snowy city toward Solomon's home, Ruth sat very straight in her seat, and her mind was already moving, already working, already doing what it had always done when she was frightened and someone she loved was in danger. She was already planning. Subscribe to this channel to support our growth. Ruth did not sleep that night. Not because the bed wasn't comfortable. Solomon's home was the kind of place that made you understand immediately that comfort had been thought about very seriously by people who were very good at it. The guest room was warm and quiet, and the sheets were softer than anything Ruth had touched in years. The kind of soft that should have pulled a tired 62-year-old woman straight under. But Ruth lay in the dark with her eyes open, and her mind running like it used to run during the long night shifts. That particular state of alertness that nurses develop over decades, where the body is still but the brain is moving through everything at once, sorting, assessing, preparing. She kept thinking about the message. "I know you found her tonight. Bring her in, and I will make sure she disappears the way she should have 40 years ago." She had turned the phone face down. She had said nothing. She had let Solomon have his 1 quiet hour in the car, and then a warm meal that his housekeeper had prepared, and then a conversation at the kitchen table that lasted until midnight. The kind of conversation that starts hesitant and careful and slowly opens up into something real. They had talked about his adoptive parents, good people who had raised him with genuine love, and were both now gone. They had talked about his company, what he had built, how he had built it. They had talked about Tobias. Ruth had shown Solomon the small notebook from her bag, the one with all the phone numbers, and he had held it in both hands and not said anything for a long time. It had been the most honest evening Ruth had spent with another human being in 6 years. And underneath all of it, the whole time, that message was sitting inside her like a stone in still water. She knew who sent it. She didn't have proof. But 62 years of reading people, 35 of them in high-pressure medical environments where character revealed itself under stress, told her exactly who had sent it. The same man who had called Solomon's oncologist. The same man who had inserted himself into Solomon's legal affairs. The same man who had spent 41 years being Frederick and had apparently not improved with age. At 6 in the morning, Ruth pushed herself up, transferred into her wheelchair with the practiced efficiency of 6 years of daily repetition, and moved to the window. The snow had stopped. The city was pale blue and still in the early morning, the streets clean and quiet, and looking out at it, Ruth felt something she hadn't expected to feel in this house, in this situation, in this particular chapter of her life. She felt clear. Not happy. Not relieved. Clear. The way the air goes clear after a storm when everything unnecessary has been stripped away, and what remains is just the essential truth of things. She knew what she needed to do. Solomon was already in the kitchen when she came down the hall. He was standing at the counter in a sweater and dark trousers, holding a coffee mug in both hands, and he looked like he hadn't slept either. There were shadows under his eyes that had nothing to do with the early hour, and his jaw had the particular tightness of someone who had been thinking hard since before dawn. He turned when he heard her wheels on the floor, and something in his face shifted. Like he was still getting used to it. Still adjusting to the reality of her being here, actual and present and real in his kitchen, after years of her existing only as a question. "Coffee," he said. "Please," Ruth said. "Strong." He poured it and set it on the counter where she could reach it, and then he looked at her for a moment and said, "You know, don't you?" Not a question. Ruth looked at him steadily. "About the message on your phone last night, yes." The coffee mug stopped halfway to his mouth. "You saw it." "I wasn't trying to. It was bright and I was sitting right there." She wrapped both hands around her own mug. "I turned it face down. I didn't tell you last night because you needed 1 hour of peace, and 1 hour of peace was not going to change anything. Solomon set his mug down on the counter carefully. His face had gone through several things in the last 10 seconds and had settled somewhere between stunned and something that looked very much like gratitude. Most people would have said something immediately. Most people aren't nurses, Ruth said. We make decisions about timing constantly. What someone needs to know right now and what can wait without causing harm. Last night you needed to eat and to breathe and to be a person for 1 hour before going back to being someone with problems. She looked at him directly. It was Frederick, wasn't it? Solomon picked his mug back up. The number is a burner. Not registered to anyone. He paused. But yes, it was Frederick. How long has this been going on? The threatening variety? About 2 months. He said it with a steadiness that told Ruth this was not the first difficult thing he had managed alone, and he had gotten very practiced at the managing. Before that it was pressure, legal inquiries, attempts to have himself recognized as next of kin in my medical paperwork. He sat down at the kitchen table. When I refused, he became less polished about it. Ruth moved her wheelchair to the table and sat across from him. Outside the window, the city was starting to wake up. Early morning lights appearing in windows across the street. The first sounds of traffic building slowly, like an orchestra tuning before the performance. Tell me about the estate, Ruth said. The real picture, not the managed version. Solomon looked at her. You want the actual numbers. I want to understand what Frederick is actually after and how much danger that represents. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the company is worth approximately $400 million. There are also properties, investments, a charitable foundation I set up 3 years ago. He said the numbers the way very wealthy people sometimes do, without drama, just as information. When I was first diagnosed, I updated my will. Everything goes to the foundation. Medical research, specifically neurological conditions, and a housing initiative for disabled adults. He paused. Frederick gets nothing. He has never been recognized legally as my father. My adoptive father is the name on every document. Ruth sat with that. And he knows this? His lawyer has made inquiries. Yes, he knows. Solomon turned his mug in a slow circle on the table. What he is hoping, I believe, is that a terminal diagnosis combined with the emotional upheaval of finding you might make me. He searched for the word. Renegotiate. He thinks finding me will make you vulnerable, Ruth said. He thinks finding me will make you vulnerable, Solomon corrected gently, and the sentence landed in the space between them like something that needed to be looked at carefully from all sides. Ruth looked at it. Frederick's logic suddenly assembled itself in her mind with the horrible clarity of something obvious once seen. He wasn't threatened by Ruth. He was planning to use Ruth. A homeless, disabled, elderly woman with no resources and no legal standing, appearing suddenly in a billionaire's life at his most emotionally fragile moment. A woman with a complicated history. A woman who had once taken money to disappear. A woman who could be made to look, to the right audience, like exactly the kind of person who had come back for exactly the wrong reasons. He was going to use her to discredit Solomon. Or worse, he was going to use her presence to suggest Solomon's judgment was compromised. That a man reuniting with a mother he'd never known while managing a terminal illness was not a man in a stable state of mind. Not a man whose legal decisions should be trusted. He's going to challenge your mental capacity, Ruth said quietly. Solomon looked at her, and in his eyes she saw that he had already arrived at the same conclusion and had been sitting with it alone. That's the working theory, yes, he said. When? My legal team believes he's waiting for the right moment. Something that looks emotional. Something that can be framed as impulsive. He looked at her. Finding a long-lost mother and bringing her into his home overnight could be framed, by the right lawyer, as exactly that kind of moment. The kitchen was very quiet. Ruth set down her coffee mug. Then we move first, she said. Solomon blinked. Excuse me? You heard me. Ruth straightened in her chair. The clarity she had woken up with was sharpening now into something specific and directed. The way clinical thinking always sharpened when the problem became concrete enough to address. You said your legal team has been anticipating this. Are they good? Excellent. Then we call them today. This morning. We document everything. The messages. The timeline of his interference in your medical affairs. The attempted insertion into your legal paperwork. All of it. She looked at him steadily. And then you make a public statement. About what? About me, Ruth said simply. About finding me. On your terms. Your words. Before Frederick can construct his version of this story and present it to anyone who matters. Solomon stared at her. You want me to go public about finding you. I want you to control the narrative before someone else does. Ruth held his gaze. I have spent 41 years being Frederick's version of a story. A woman who abandoned her child. A woman who took money and left. That version has existed for 4 decades, and I could not fight it because I did not have a platform or resources or any way to make my voice louder than his family's money. She paused. You have all of those things. And I am telling you, as the person Frederick is planning to weaponize against you, that the single most effective thing you can do right now is take that weapon out of his hands by showing the world what actually happened. All of it. The truth. The silence stretched between them. Solomon was looking at her with an expression Ruth could not immediately name. Then she realized what it was. It was the expression of someone watching a person they have just met reveal themselves to be something they weren't expecting. Not in a frightening way. In the way that makes you recalibrate. In the way that makes you understand that the person across from you has a great deal more inside them than the surface suggested. You've been planning this since last night, he said. Since about 3 this morning, Ruth admitted. I had time. And then, for the second time, Solomon laughed. Real and genuine and surprised, and this time Ruth laughed with him. And for a moment in the early morning light of that kitchen, it was possible to forget about tumors and threatening text messages and the slow circling of a desperate man waiting for his moment. For just a moment, it was just a mother and her son drinking coffee at a table. Then Solomon's phone rang. His legal team. He had clearly already called them before Ruth came downstairs. He looked at her, raised one finger, one moment, and stepped into the next room. Ruth sat at the table and breathed. She looked around the kitchen. At the clean lines of it, the morning light coming through the windows, the slight evidence of a man who lived alone in a space designed for more people than currently occupied it. A single coffee mug by the machine. One chair pulled out at the table. The specific quietness of a house where one person moves through many rooms and the rooms remember the absence of everyone else. She thought about Emmanuel's kitchen. The chaos of it. Tobias stealing food from everyone's plates. The drawings on the refrigerator. The noise and the warmth and the ordinary holiness of a full house. She thought about Tobias saying he didn't want to die. 14 years old and telling a nurse to find his mother and tell her he loved her. She gripped the edge of the table. Not today, she said to herself. Not today for falling apart. Today there is something to do, and you have always been better with something to do. Solomon came back into the kitchen. His face was different again. Alert now. Moving into a different mode. The way people shift when they have stopped anticipating a problem and started addressing it. My legal team has been documenting Frederick's interference for 8 months, he said. They have enough for a restraining order. They were waiting for my instruction to move. He sat back down. I was hesitant because he stopped. Seemed to decide on honesty. Because some part of me kept hoping he was genuinely trying to know me. Some part of me that I am not particularly proud of kept leaving the door open. Ruth nodded slowly. Because no matter what he did or didn't do, he is your father. Yes. And wanting your father to be better than he is not weakness, Ruth said. It is one of the most human things there is. I spent years wanting Frederick at 21 to be someone different than he was. She looked at her son. But love that requires you to accept harm is not love. It is just harm with a familiar face. Solomon looked at her for a long moment. Where have you been for 41 years? He said quietly. Not bitterly. Not as an accusation. Just as a genuine expression of the weight of lost time. Looking for you, Ruth said simply. He nodded. Swallowed. Then picked up his phone and made the call. What happened next moved quickly in the way that things move quickly when they have been building for a long time, and finally the pressure releases all at once. Solomon's legal team filed for the restraining order before noon. The documentation they had accumulated was substantial. Phone records, financial inquiries, the interference with medical paperwork, the threatening messages from the burner phone which, it turned out, was not as untraceable as Frederick had believed. A man in his 70s attempting to navigate anonymous digital communication was, according to Solomon's lawyer, not as careful as he thought he was. By mid-afternoon, Frederick had been served. Solomon's communications team released a statement. Not a legal document. Not a corporate announcement. A personal statement, written in Solomon's own words after 2 hours of drafting at the kitchen table with Ruth sitting across from him, offering the kind of honest, unvarnished feedback that only someone who has nothing to perform can give. It told the truth. Not all of it. Some of it was private and would remain so. But the shape of it. A man who found his mother. A woman who never stopped looking. 41 years and a park bench in the snow on her birthday. The response was not what Frederick had calculated. Because Frederick had built his strategy on a version of Ruth that existed only in the story his mother had constructed 40 years ago. He had never accounted for who Ruth actually was. What she had survived. What she looked like to the world when the world could actually see her. A 62-year-old woman. A nurse for 35 years. A mother who lost a husband and a son in one night and still got up every morning. A woman who had been homeless for 4 months and had spent her birthday alone in the snow singing to herself because there was nobody else there to sing to. And who had, despite all of it, spent 41 years looking for a child she was forced to give up and never once stopped. The public, it turned out, had a great deal of feeling about that story. 3 weeks later, Ruth was sitting in the office of the city's leading oncology specialist. She had insisted on coming to every appointment. Solomon had not argued, which told her he had not actually wanted to go alone and had simply never had anyone to go with. She sat beside his chair in her wheelchair with her notebook open. A new one, not the old one with the phone numbers. That one was retired now, put away somewhere safe, and she asked questions. Precise ones. The kind that came from 35 years of medical knowledge and 2 decades of watching doctors talk around difficult truths and learning how to make them speak plainly. The specialist, a careful woman named Dr. Adiz Osei, who wore her credentials with the ease of someone who had earned them the hard way, looked at Ruth after the third very specific question and said, "Are you in medicine?" "Retired nurse," Ruth said. 35 years. Dr. Osei nodded, and something in her manner shifted. Not unprofessionally, but with the recognition of one medical person by another. She began speaking more directly, more completely, and Ruth listened and took notes and asked the questions Solomon was too close to the situation to think of asking. There was a clinical trial. New, aggressive, high risk and high reward in the way that made cautious doctors use the words promising and uncertain in the same sentence. It was not a cure. Medicine was not in the business of promising cures for what Solomon had. But it was something. A real something, not the careful kind. A treatment that in early results had shown responses in tumors that had stopped responding to conventional therapy. Solomon looked at Ruth when Dr. Osei finished explaining it. Ruth looked at her notes. Then at Dr. Osei. "Enrollment timeline? We have a slot opening in 6 weeks, Dr. Osei said. "He'll take it," Ruth said. Solomon looked at her. "I haven't." "You were about to," Ruth said. "You were sitting there talking yourself into hesitating because you've been making every frightening decision alone for 3 years, and you've gotten used to the weight of that, and it has made you slow." She looked at him with the particular expression she had deployed on reluctant patients for 3 decades. "You have someone to make them with now. And I am telling you, take the slot." The room was very quiet. Dr. Osei had the professional grace to look at her paperwork. Solomon looked at his mother. And on his face was something Ruth had not seen there yet in the 3 weeks they had known each other. Something that went beyond gratitude and beyond relief and beyond even the complicated sweetness of found family. It was trust. Complete, immediate, whole trust. The kind that doesn't have to be built over years because something in the blood already knows. "Okay," he said quietly. "We take the slot." On the evening of January the 3rd, 3 weeks after a birthday in the snow, Ruth Abigail Mensah sat in a warm apartment. Solomon had arranged it the day after they met, accessible, safe, 2 floors below a family who apparently cooked extraordinary things on Sunday mornings based on what floated down the hallway, and she opened a new notebook. On the first page, she wrote 2 things. First, she wrote Tobias's name, and Emmanuel's. She wrote them the way you write the names of people who are gone but not absent, people who live in the part of you that doesn't reduce. Then below that she wrote Solomon. She looked at the page for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called her son. He answered on the second ring, the way he had answered every time she called in 3 weeks, without exception, regardless of what he was doing. "How's the headache today?" she asked. She asked every day. "Better than yesterday," he said. Which was what he said when it was true, and also sometimes when it wasn't, but she was learning to tell the difference. "Liar," she said gently. He laughed. "The real one. The one she was collecting." "I'll be honest," he said. "It's about the same. But," he paused, "I am significantly less afraid than I was a month ago." Which counts for something. "It counts for a great deal," Ruth said. They talked for an hour. About the trial. About the foundation work Solomon wanted her involved in. A new initiative for disabled adults experiencing homelessness, something they had designed together at the kitchen table, something that had Ruth's 35 years of medical understanding built into its bones. About small things too. About what Ruth was reading. About a memory Solomon had of his adoptive mother that he wanted to share. About Tobias's paper bag drawings, which Ruth had described so many times and in such detail that Solomon had quietly commissioned an artist to recreate one from her description. A surprise she had not yet received but would find on her doorstep the following morning. When they finally said goodnight, Ruth sat in the quiet of her apartment and she looked out the window at the city. Somewhere out there was the park bench, the birthday cake, the one unlit candle pointing at the sky. She had made a wish. She had wished to find her son before she died. And here was what Ruth Abigail Mensah knew, 62 years into a life that had given her extraordinary joy and extraordinary devastation in approximately equal measure. Wishes don't come the way you expect them to. They don't arrive cleanly. They arrive wrapped in difficulty and complication, and things you didn't ask for. They arrive at the worst possible time in the best possible way. They arrive in the snow on your birthday, when you have blown out a candle alone and the world has gone quiet and you have almost stopped believing. And then a car stops, and everything changes. Ruth closed the new notebook, put it on the table beside her Bible and the old one with all the phone numbers, turned off the lamp, and for the first time in 6 years, Ruth Abigail Mensah slept. Deeply, completely, without the particular alertness that grief installs in a person like a permanent night shift. She slept like someone who had finally, after 41 years and every kind of loss imaginable, come to the end of a very long search, and found exactly what she was looking for. Subscribe to this channel to support our growth. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded today that it is never too late. Not for love, not for family, not for the wishes we make in the dark when we think nobody is listening. God is listening.